At first glance, the wreck in Domo Cove looks like one of the many aircraft that never came home from the Pacific War. A cockpit sits under warm tropical water. Wings stretch across the seabed. Engines and propellers are still recognizable beneath marine growth. The aircraft is unmistakably a B-17 flying fortress. But one major part is missing. The tail is gone. It did not disappear because the sea destroyed it. American servicemen pulled the tail and rear fuselage ashore in 1944, after the wreck had been underwater for more than a year. The rest of the bomber stayed where it was. That should have given the recovered section the better chance of survival. Instead, the opposite happened. The part left underwater can still be visited today. The part dragged onto dry land disappeared from the historical record. The aircraft was Boeing B-17E, serial number 41-2420, known to its crew as Bessie the Jap Basher. It had been delivered to the United States Army Air Forces in November 1941, and eventually joined the 42nd Bombardment Squadron of the 11th Bombardment Group in the South Pacific. By September 1942, Guadalcanal was still a brutal and unsettled battlefield. Henderson Field had become one of the most important pieces of ground in the Solomon Islands. From Henderson Field, American aircraft could strike Japanese shipping and bases farther north, but those missions pushed men and machines far from the relative safety of the island. Bessie was one of the bombers flying those missions. Its crew on the final flight numbered 9. Norton was the pilot. Bruce Barker flew beside him as co-pilot, with Leo Eminger navigating, James Mathewson serving as bombardier, and 5 other crewmen spread through the bomber as radio operator and gunners. On September 24th, Norton took off from Henderson Field with the other 8 men aboard. 4 B-17s were sent toward Japanese shipping around the Shortland and Tonole Harbor area, south of Bougainville. The route carried them away from Guadalcanal and out across the Solomon Islands. The farther north they flew, the farther any damaged aircraft would have to travel to get back. That distance would become the defining fact of Bessie's final mission. The mission was small, the distance was not. When the bombers reached the target area, they attacked Japanese cargo vessels. Norton's award citation later reported that bombs from his aircraft struck a ship and that the vessel took on a noticeable list. It was a wartime combat claim, not proof that Bessie had sunk the vessel, but it shows that Norton's bomber was directly involved in the attack. Then the situation changed. About 20 Japanese fighters came in against the 4 B-17s. The official Navy communique issued the following day also described roughly 20 defending fighters. Whatever uncertainty surrounds individual combat claims, the scale of the interception is clear. The B-17E carried heavy defensive armament, including powered gun turrets. That gave its crew a way to fight back, but it did not make the aircraft immune to damage. Bessie was hit hard. The surviving citation describing the action says, Norton's aircraft was smoking and disabled as fighters continued to pursue it. The bomber lost altitude and descended toward the surface. Those are the facts that can be proved. Smoke, loss of height, and enemy fighters still attacking. The citation does not give a reliable minute-by-minute account of which controls or systems failed. Bessie was still flying, but not normally. That moment could easily have become the end of the story. The Japanese base area was hundreds of miles from Guadalcanal. Bessie was damaged, smoking, and being driven lower. If it went down there, the aircraft might have vanished into the sea with little more than a combat loss entry left behind. Instead, it turned for home. Exactly what was working inside Bessie during that return flight is not fully documented. There is no need to invent a list of failed engines, damaged controls, or leaking systems. What the evidence does show is more important. The aircraft had taken severe fighter damage, yet Norton and his crew somehow kept it moving southeast toward Guadalcanal. Every mile mattered. Damage that was survivable for a short time could become more serious over a long flight. Bessie had to remain controllable and structurally intact long enough to cover the distance. It kept going. There was no repair station between the Shortlands and Henderson Field. Whatever the crew could do had to be done inside the damaged bomber while it remained in the air. The important fact is not a reconstructed sequence of emergency procedures. It is the accumulating distance. Minute after minute, the aircraft remained airborne. The fighter attack that had begun over the Shortlands was eventually behind it. Ahead was open water, then eventually the coastline of Guadalcanal. That coastline changed the problem. The crew had succeeded in bringing the airplane back to the island, but Bessie still had to survive the final approach to land. A runway was only useful if the aircraft could reach it in a condition that allowed a landing. For the men aboard, reaching the island did not guarantee reaching Henderson Field. Bessie came back far enough to put Guadalcanal within reach, but not far enough to make a normal landing. The bomber went into the sea at Domo Cove, west of Henderson Field. It was an extraordinary final position for an aircraft that had been in serious trouble far to the northwest. The wreck would later be found only about 100 yards offshore. Bessie had crossed the long stretch back from the combat area and finished not in open ocean, but in shallow water beside the island it had been trying to reach. For years afterward, some summaries would place the loss near Shortland Island, confusing the location of the battle with the location of the actual wreck. The aircraft on the seabed tells a different story. Bessie did not go down near the target. It came almost all the way home. The ditching itself was enough to damage a heavy aircraft even if the first impact was survivable. Water can stop an airplane with enormous force, and a damaged bomber hitting the sea could break apart as it slowed. Later divers would find Bessie on its belly, with the rear fuselage separated from the main wreck. But the aircraft was only part of what had been lost. 9 men had left Henderson Field aboard Bessie. At least 2 of them are known to have reached shore. One was Norton. The other was gunner Bruce Osborne. What happened next is far less certain than the combat mission. Norton was captured by Japanese forces. Japanese records connected to the case later stated that he died after being taken into custody. Some later accounts describe him as having been executed, but the surviving evidence does not establish the exact circumstances strongly enough to say that with certainty. Osborne also made it to land. Then his trail disappears. More than a year later, in January 1944, American servicemen found skeletal remains near Domo Cove that were identified as Osborne's. How he died is unknown. The same problem surrounds the rest of Bessie's crew. The evidence does not provide a secure final sequence for the remaining 7 men. There are later theories and assumptions, but not enough reliable documentation to turn those theories into fact. That uncertainty matters because it changes the meaning of what happened next. 16 months after Bessie went into the water, the battlefront had moved on. American forces had gained control of the area. The aircraft, however, was still offshore. On January 29, 1944, men of the 61st Naval Construction Battalion, the Seabees, located a submerged B-17 in Domo Cove. 2 days later, Navy divers went down to examine it. The location itself made the discovery striking. Domo Cove was not some distant point on the route home. The wreck lay just offshore from Guadalcanal, west of Henderson Field. 16 months earlier, Bessie had been fighting for altitude far to the northwest. Now the Seabees could reach the aircraft from the same island its crew had been trying to regain. The aircraft had been missing for only 16 months. The war was still underway, and the bomber might still contain equipment, personal effects, or identifying evidence. The scene they found was remarkably clear. The bomber was sitting on its belly about 100 yards from shore in roughly 55 feet of water. The rear fuselage had separated. The tail showed heavy battle damage. The tail gunner area had been badly burned. Engines were still present on the main wreck. The divers also recorded the condition of the tail in detail. Bullet holes marked the section, and the tail gunner area showed evidence of severe fire damage. Those observations did not explain every failure aboard Bessie, but they matched the broader wartime record of an aircraft that had been heavily hit before it reached Guadalcanal. The wreck was not merely in the right place with the right serial number. Its physical condition was consistent with the violent final mission described in contemporary records. And the aircraft still carried the evidence needed to identify it. On the tail, the divers could read the number, 12420. That was enough. The wreck was B-17E 41-2420. Bessie had been found. That painted number is one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the entire story. It ties the underwater aircraft directly to the bomber that left Henderson Field on September 24th. It also removes one of the easiest ways a wartime wreck story can become distorted over time. Whatever later summaries said about Shortland, the serial number was sitting on a B-17 in Domo Cove. There was no need for a decades-later identification theory based on photographs, dimensions, or fragments. 16 months after the ditching, the aircraft was still carrying its military identity on its own skin. The divers began to search the wreck. What they found made the aircraft feel less like abandoned machinery and more like a moment from 1942 that had been submerged and left in place. A .50 caliber machine gun was still loaded. Ammunition remained aboard. Spent cartridge cases were also present inside the aircraft. Parachutes and life vests were still there. So were smaller personal objects, spectacles, a flashlight, tools, a hunting knife, a pistol. None of those objects could explain everything that had happened after the aircraft reached Domo Cove, but together they showed how much of the final flight had remained inside the wreck. The loaded gun, ammunition, parachutes, and personal equipment had gone into the water with the bomber and remained there for more than a year. A pair of spectacles or a flashlight was far more personal than any piece of machinery. Bessie had gone into the water, carrying the equipment and personal effects of men who had been fighting only hours earlier. Then, on February 19th, searchers found another object, a briefcase. It carried the name C.E. Norton. The pilot who had managed to bring the crippled bomber back across hundreds of miles of ocean had left a personal trace inside the aircraft, even though he himself had reached shore. The wreck could confirm identity. It could preserve ammunition, equipment, and personal belongings. It could show damage, but it could not answer every question about the crew. No simple discovery inside the fuselage explained what happened to all 9 men after the ditching. The aircraft had survived as evidence, but it was incomplete evidence. The Seabees now had another practical question. What could be recovered? Bessie was not a museum project. No one was approaching the wreck as a restoration effort for future display. This was wartime Guadalcanal. The aircraft was damaged, partly broken, and lying underwater near shore. The rear fuselage was already separated from the main body. That made one section much easier to move than the complete aircraft. A Seabee diver named SC. Kelly recorded the method. A hook was attached to the tail skid. The Seabees had a separated rear section, a practical attachment point, and a shoreline close enough to make dragging the piece possible. Then the rear section was pulled. The movement was simple compared with the enormous salvage operations that would be used decades later to recover historic aircraft from lakes, swamps, glaciers, or deep water. But in January 1944, the objective was immediate and practical. There was a detached section of a wartime bomber close to shore, and the Seabees dragged it in. The line tightened. For the first time since September 1942, part of Bessie began moving again. The tail and rear fuselage came through the water toward Guadalcanal. There was no spectacular full aircraft lift. The significance was simpler. A part of a bomber that had vanished into the sea in 1942 was being returned to the island. That section had spent roughly 16 months submerged. Now it reached land. The rest did not. The cockpit remained offshore. The wings remained offshore. The engines remained offshore. Most of the bomber stayed on the bottom. In purely practical terms, the difference was substantial. A detached rear fuselage was one problem. A complete B-17 with wings, engines, damaged structure, and the mass of the entire submerged aircraft was another. There is no evidence that the Seabees were attempting anything like a modern, full aircraft restoration. The rear section came ashore. The main wreck did not. That was the moment when Bessie became 2 separate historical objects. One part was now on land. One part remained beneath the sea. The recovery also changed what could still be seen of the aircraft. Once the separated rear fuselage had been hauled away, anyone returning to the site would find an incomplete B-17. The missing tail was now evidence of human intervention, rather than simply battle damage or decay. That distinction matters today, because the shape seen by modern divers is partly the result of what happened in 1942, and partly the result of what the Seabees did in 1944. After the rear fuselage and tail were brought ashore, their trail becomes uncertain. There is no reliable record showing where the section finally went. It may have entered the enormous wartime salvage system. It may have been scrapped or moved. But those are possibilities, not documented conclusions. The honest answer is simpler. The fate of Bessie's recovered tail is unknown. Meanwhile, the larger section of the bomber stayed in Domo Cove. Years became decades. The war ended. Guadalcanal ceased to be the place it had been in 1942, when bombers departed Henderson Field for missions, while Japanese forces still contested the campaign. The machinery of wartime salvage disappeared, records became scattered, and Bessie's missing tail became harder rather than easier to trace. Domo Cove changed more slowly. Salt water attacked metal surfaces, marine organisms covered the airframe, sediment shifted around it, parts deteriorated. But Bessie did not vanish. Modern divers can still descend to the wreck in roughly 17 to 18 meters of water. The aircraft is not sitting untouched as it did in 1944. 8 decades underwater have changed it. Aluminium, steel, cables, fittings, and weapons do not all survive immersion in the same way, and marine growth can hide details that were once obvious. Still, the main form remains recognizable. That recognizability is important. Many underwater aircraft eventually become fields of detached components that only specialists can identify. Bessie still presents large connected shapes. The span of the wings, the mass of the engines, and the enclosed cockpit give a diver an immediate sense of the machine rather than only its debris. The cockpit is there. The wings are there. Engines and propellers remain part of the wreck. A diver swimming toward it does not have to imagine the shape of a B-17 from scattered fragments. The aircraft still reads as a flying fortress. That makes Bessie different from many wartime losses. It is not a deep ocean wreck known only from sonar. It is not an aircraft that was raised, rebuilt, and polished into a museum exhibit. It is not a machine returned to flight. Bessie remains where its last mission ended. And because the wreck is still there, the physical evidence continues to correct the written record. The target area was near Shortland. The wreck is not. It lies at Guadalcanal. The bomber had been reported smoking and disabled far from home, yet the airframe on the bottom proves that Norton and his crew carried it back across the sea. The aircraft did not make the runway, but it reached the island. For Norton and his crew, there is no equally clean ending. At least Norton and Osborne reached shore. Norton was captured and died in Japanese custody. Osborne's remains were found near Domo Cove in 1944. The exact fate of the others remains uncertain. The wreck can take the story only so far. It can show where Bessie came down. It can preserve the number 12420. It can hold ammunition, equipment carried on the final flight, and a briefcase marked with the pilot's name. But it cannot fill every gap left by war. What it can do is preserve the contradiction. On September 24, 1942, Bessie looked like an aircraft that might disappear somewhere between the Shortlands and Guadalcanal. Instead, it crossed hundreds of miles and reached the island. 16 months later, Seabees found it in shallow water, identified it by the number still visible on its tail, searched its interior, and pulled the separated rear fuselage onto land. They left the larger wreck offshore. More than 80 years later, divers can still descend into Domo Cove and see the cockpit, wings, engines, and propellers of the bomber that fought its way back toward Henderson Field. Bessie was never restored. It was never rebuilt. It never flew again. Its final survival took a different form. The Seabees pulled Bessie's tail out of the sea and left the rest behind. 8 decades later, the tail has disappeared. The sea kept everything else.